Hello and welcome to our next section. This one is called Evolution via Natural Selection, and we've been talking about the fossil record and geologic time scale, and right now we're going to look a little bit more at explaining some of the data that's in the fossil record. So, giving you a little historical background, by the beginning of the 19th century, biologists we're observing that living organisms were very different from fossil organisms. The fossils that they were seeing, that they were finding in rocks, were not the same as the organisms that were around them. So scientists tried to come up with a theory to explain this discrepancy, and the theory of evolution was one that was tossed about. That is that organisms from the past gave rise to organisms of the present. And remember what a theory is. It explains current observations, explains what is being observed, explains the data, and it is able to predict new observations. So in this case, observations about how organisms change through time. So how could this happen? How can we explain something like this? And let's look at a couple of different scientists and how they tried to explain this idea. So one of the first scientists to propose that organisms change through time was a French biologist by the name of Jean-Baptiste Lamarck in the late 1700s. And when he proposed this, he tried to explain it through a hypothesis that came to be known as use and disuse. So that basically means that his explanation for that was that a change in the environment produces a need for change in animals, and if an animal needs to use one part of its body frequency, that part will become stronger and more well-developed. And then conversely, if an animal uses some part of its body infrequently, that part will slowly weaken, become smaller, may disappear altogether. So one of his assumptions was that these acquired characteristics would be passed on to the offspring in that changed form. Obviously, this hypothesis was rejected because that is not what happens. We know, like, if a male and a female increase the size of their muscles through weight training, their children will not be born with large muscles. We know that from observation. So we reject this hypothesis. So Lamarck, obviously his hypothesis was rejected, and it may surprise you that for more than 100 years, extensive experimentation was done, and trying to see if acquired characteristics could be inherited. And the extensive experimentation failed to show that acquired characteristics are inherited. A man by the name of Charles Darwin that you've heard about, he lived from 1809 to 1882. He came up with a different explanation about the mechanism of evolution. And there were a lot of different aspects that influenced him as he came to some of his conclusions. He traveled quite extensively on a ship called the Beagle and observed a lot of different organisms around the world. He was also influenced by other scientists. One of the big ideas that influenced him was an idea called Uniformitarianism. It is the idea that was developed by other scientists, Lyell, who actually he wasn't the first one to come up with the idea. James Hutton was the original scientist that came up with the idea that geologic forces produced changes on Earth in the past, and that those same forces will continue to produce changes in the future. So that is a key idea behind a lot of what Darwin proposed and a lot of his explanations. So what was Darwin's big explanation? And the reason that Darwin is so famous is not that he came up with the idea of evolution. Evolution had been around for a long, long time. it's that when he published The Origin of Species in 1859, it was the first time that evolution had been explained in a way that could be tested and that data could actually be observed in order to test the mechanism by which it was being explained. That had never been done before. So Darwin proposed that new forms of life are produced by means of natural selection. And that's what we're going to focus on. His explanation of evolution had to do with natural selection. Natural selection is simply the idea that some members of a population or species have either physical or behavioral characteristics that enable them to survive and to produce more offspring than others. So once again, it's all about producing offspring. Who can produce the most offspring, and how will that change the population over time? And that is what natural selection is all about. So let's just look at this using some different examples and different ideas. Suppose we have a population of beetles, green and orange beetles. And here's the population. We're going to look at natural selection at work right here. We have the predators up here selecting their favorite, the green beetles. Even though there aren't very many of these orange beetles, the green ones are removed from the population at a very regular rate. And generations later, we're going to find that the population of these other beetles has risen because they are not being selected out of the population by the predator. Eventually, we're going to have a population that looks like this. The green beetles have been selected against, and these orange beetles have flourished. And this is the idea of natural selection, that as different kinds of selection happen, either in favor or against certain variations of a population, we get a change in that population over time. So key words here are variations. We have some variations right here. Look at this population of ladybugs. There's a lot of variation in their shell, in the colors and the spots on their shell. Here's some more. Here's a picture of, this is one organism, one species of plant, of flower, and here are a lot of variations of that one species. So within any given population, we have these natural variations. And when we're talking about natural selection, and we use the term adaptation, that means favorable variations. So for natural selection to happen, we have to have variation. And adaptations would be that some of those variations would be favorable, or there would be some that would be unfavorable, meaning the other ones would be favorable. So for some reason, we get one of these that's more favorable than the other, and that more of those individuals tend to survive in the population, and the others do not. Those individuals tend to survive and reproduce. That's a really key point. Reproduction is another main point, another important part of natural selection. Those organisms would survive, reproduce, make more, and eventually, over a long period of time, that population would tend to shift and change. Variation aids adaptation. So remember those terms. The variation will aid in that favorable adaptation, choosing certain variations over others. Here is just an example. When Darwin was on his travels, he observed finches. He was very interested in the different beak types of finches and recorded a tremendous amount of data about all of these different beak types. These beak types are very special for the items that these finches eat. These are crushing type beaks over here. Here's a cactus eater, a probing beak. We have insect eaters here and a fruit eater here. And the beaks are very, very different according to the diet of the different finches. This is because the adaptations for their diet are that these are the beaks that were selected for. It assisted them in being able to eat the kinds of things that each of the particular species of finch eats. So let's kind of go over this in a more organized way. And we're talking about natural selection, about this idea of explaining how evolution occurs. We are looking at organisms with favorable variations. There have to be variations in the population. Some will end up being favorable. They're the ones that are most likely to survive and reproduce. In a population, we have to have variation. Organisms that might have unfavorable variations then would be less successful at reproduction, and they'd eventually die out. We wouldn't see them in the population any longer at some point. Variations can be inherited, and we know that from observations and from data that we see around us. And favorable variations are called adaptations. Those variations would accumulate in a population over time. And then if organisms with favorable variations become so different from members of the original species that they can no longer produce, we get a new species that evolves. So that is the idea behind natural selection, which explains the process of evolution where organisms change over time. And when we talk about selection itself, just an important thing to think about, there are different kinds of selection. We're talking about natural selection here. Naturally, we can have ecological selection where because of the ecology, because of the environment that is changing, different traits or behaviors may be selected for or against, and we get that process of natural selection occurring over a long period of time in a population. There's also sexual selection, and here I put the pictures of the cute little blue-footed boobies because their feet are so blue, and they do very, very elaborate mating dances and rituals prior to mating. If these organisms do not have just the right dance, they won't mate. And so sexual selection we see that all over throughout all of life on this planet. There are certain characteristics, certain behaviors that are really important for different organisms to be able to mate. And so sexual selection also causes changes in populations over time. We can also have what's called artificial selection, where human beings have done this for a long time. And a great example is dog breeds, where certain traits or characteristics, colors, whatever, temperaments are bred out or bred into different dogs. And we end up having, although canines are all considered to be in one species, their ancestor being the wolf, we have many variations within that species, so much so that some of them really can no longer mate. So it's a big question, are they really all in the same species? Certainly a Great Dane and a Chihuahua would not be capable of producing offspring. So here's an example of artificial selection. It doesn't occur naturally, but human beings have caused the evolution of many different breeds of dogs. So let's just review what we've talked about here. With this being our observation, organisms change through time. We know that happens. There are two individuals, two scientists who gave us some great ideas. We have Lamarck, use and disuse hypothesis that he proposed, Darwin, who proposed the theory of natural selection, and those different theories were trying to explain that particular observation. Darwin's theory prevailed because it explains existing observations and it's able to predict future observations. And as we continue to observe and collect data, we continue to ask ourselves, Does natural selection still hold? Does it still apply to the new observations that we're seeing, future observations? And so we still continue to question, and if that continues to prove true, then that theory just becomes stronger and stronger over time. Lamarck's theory obviously did not hold water because it was not didn't explain what we were observing. So, some advanced ideas for you. What is catastrophism? Thomas Malthus, how did he influence Darwin's ideas? Research Darwin's travels. How long did he spend in different regions? What observations most influenced his work? Other ideas, any other questions that you have as we're considering some of these different topics? Please do a little research, come in, show me what you know, and you can have some advanced proficiency for that. So I look forward to seeing you in class.